Okay, real quick, let's just talk about the languages that you're going to encounter throughout this course. I'll try to keep this pretty brief here because, frankly, it is pretty brief at this early in the course. Okay, so we're about to get into some of the what's new sections, a couple of things after this here. So just a little bit about the languages, just enough to familiarize you with what they are, who uses them, what the purpose of them is. Okay, as we get into the chapters that are specific about that, we'll get into the details. Okay, now in the old days, right? So I'm talking about like 1996. Here's what we could say. SQL Server has one language, and it's called Transact-SQL, and that's the only language that you'll use, okay? Now, Transact-SQL, this is a key term that you will need to know. We'll call this sometimes, T-SQL or T-SQL, okay? This is the language of SQL Server in 1996, okay? Now, today, you'll learn a little bit more about it, okay? But if it's 1996, right, this was the only thing that you had to worry about. Now, today in 2012, the typical developer or DBA working with SQL Server has to be familiar with at least a half dozen languages. Okay? It's way different because the scope of the product is way different, right? In the old days, we had only the database engine. Okay. Once then SQL Server 7.0 came out and we had DTS, okay, well now maybe I need to know a little bit about VB script or I need to know about ActiveX and then we had OLAP services and okay, things were starting to get a little bit more evolved. And today is just a lot more languages out there, okay. Now the SQL in SQL Server 2012, okay, I don't care how you pronounce it. I say SQL. I know some people, particularly a lot of the European folks, will say SQL, just use the acronym. I don't think I've ever heard anybody in real life say squeal, although I think that you probably could. But SQL is, in the United States at least, the dominant way we say it, SQL Server, okay? MySQL. Some people will say MySQL, okay? So pronounce it however you want. Nobody's going to make a judgment on your skills or knowledge based on how you pronounce the product name. Okay? Now, SQL, the actual language, is a language. Okay? So let's just talk about SQL. Not SQL Server 2012, just SQL, SQL. Okay? This is the structured query language. That's what SQL is going to stand for here. And this is actually a standardized language. And we'll talk more about this when we get into the chapters on development. When we talk about how to write queries and such like that, we'll get into more detail about, structured query language and the history of it and blah, blah, blah. Okay. Right now, just understand SQL is a standard language. Kind of like HTML is a standard or CSS is a standard. Okay. SQL is a standard. Okay. Now, this is where it gets a little complex. Okay. Transact-SQL is Microsoft's implementation of the SQL standard. Now, this is a little bit difficult for some people coming into this that are brand new to SQL to understand. For example, going back, I said HTML is also a standard. Well, does Safari have its own version of HTML that it uses? Does Firefox have its own version? How about Google Chrome? And God help us all if Internet Explorer had their own version of HTML. They don't, right? They all use the same standard of HTML. In the relational database world, though, that's not how it works. Everybody has their own implementation of the standard. And it kind of looks like, here's how I describe it. Like imagine just a circle that encompasses the ISO standard. Okay? So this is everything that the standard says, this is valid SQL. Okay? Now here comes Microsoft, and Microsoft says, well, we'll implement some of that. Okay? And so here's Transact-SQL. This is Microsoft's interpretation / implementation of it. Okay? So where you see right here, this is our standard Venn diagram, right? This part right here in the middle, these are things that are in the standard that Microsoft supports. Okay? outside, over on this side, we have extensions, okay? These are things that are defined by the standard that Microsoft SQL Server 2012 does not implement, okay? And then on this side over here, these are the actual extensions here. These are things that Microsoft does that are not part of the standard. And you might think that this is, oh gosh, here's Microsoft just being a bully again or whatever, but it's really not. This is actually how everybody does it. If we were to erase the Transact-SQL part up here and say, no, let's make this PL-SQL, which is Oracle's implementation here, it would look the exact same way. So every company does this the same way. There is no, as of 2012, that I'm aware of, no single product that is completely going to implement the entire standard and do nothing more than a standard. Okay, it just doesn't happen. Okay, so this is absolutely normal here. I'm going to erase the PL SQL here just so you can get back to the T-SQL version here. Okay, but so it's a little bit different in the database world than it might be in other situations like browsers that you're familiar with. Okay, every company, it's up to them how much of the standard they want to actually create, and ours is Transact-SQL. You'll see it T-SQL a lot of times as well. Extensions you kind of understand, okay? Now, the reason this is important is every time that you query the database engine, okay, and that's what it's called. Every command that goes to the database engine is called a query, structured query language, okay, SQL, okay? So that means your select statements, even your inserts, update, and delete statements are still called queries. Okay? And we also have create table, create procedure, create view, create trigger, create function. Okay? And then we have things like controlling our transactions, rolling back a transaction, committing a transaction, executing compiled code like a stored procedure. Okay? And, you know, if you're not familiar with these, that's totally cool. That's why you're here. When we get into some of the later chapters, you'll find how all of this works. Okay, just a couple of Transact-SQL queries here I think would be helpful. In this case, we have a select query. Now, a select statement, as we'll learn, is a read-only statement. We're not modifying the database. We're simply sending data back to the caller. What are we sending back to the caller? We're sending back two columns, first name and last name. From where? Where did we get the data in those columns? We got the data from the employee table. Okay? And what data? The entire table? No, only those that met our criteria. Office ID column had to be 4, and the department ID had to be 200. And so it brought that data back. Okay? That's Transact-SQL. Now, it just so happens this is also ISO standard SQL because we've not used any extensions here. Okay. Here's a delete statement, delete sales.fy98 where customer number equals 3948. We're saying remove the rows. That's what the delete query does. The delete statement will actually remove rows from sales.fy98 table that meet the criteria. Okay. And in this case, this may be the one that's the most confusing to people. We have what are called stored procedures in SQL, okay? And they're just compiled code, and you don't, instead of having to execute all the lines individually, you can just give it a name and execute. Use the exec, which is just an abbreviation for execute. Just say execute my stored procedure, and we pass parameters. And I know for those of you coming from Oracle and MySQL and some of the other languages, this is probably an unfamiliar syntax to you. Again, when we get into our development chapter, we're going to cover much more. All right, moving right along. XML. XML is actually used by all of the products. However, big however, the amount that you need to know to actually run your SQL Server may be 0. It depends on your job function and how deep you're going to get, but you may not have to know any XML. You could be a database administrator on a production level SQL Server with a 100 gig database and not know the first thing about XML. Okay? Now, having said that, XML is far easier to learn than something like HTML. So I don't know why you would want to not learn XML. But the point is that even though it is ubiquitous, we do see it everywhere, doesn't mean that you have to be an expert in XML to understand SQL Server. Okay? The database engine, for example, one of the things that you will find is pretty helpful, I think, is that there is an XML data type. So we can actually store XML documents or even fragments inside of a column. Okay? That's pretty handy. Analysis services uses XMLA, which is the XML for analysis. Okay? Integration services, you can actually do your transform with XML. We can import, we can extract from XML, or we can load into XML. So it can participate in all three parts here. Reporting services, remember I talked in the last video about those RDL files, your report definition files. Those are actually XML. Web service calls are always XML based, right? Now here's something you might want to pull up the PDF. This is on page 10, so that it might be easier to read for you. But on here, notice up here that we are creating a table, and I'm running off of my page. Hold on, sorry. Takes me a second to get my little tablet going here. Now notice we're creating a table called product description. Okay? We have two columns, product ID and instructions. Now these columns are given data types. Okay, the first column is an integer. The second column, however, is XML. Okay? Now when we later do an insert into that table, and again we will learn the insert statement, so I'm going over this quickly. Okay? We'll do the first column, we'll separate it by a comma, and then we'll do the second column for the instructions that are XML. Okay? So the first column is 1, and then we separate it by this comma, and I know the language maybe makes it a little bit confusing, okay? But this is actually an apostrophe, so we open an apostrophe and we close our apostrophe. Okay? So this is what our XML looks for. We have a product element with an attribute ID of 1. Okay? And so we're actually storing the XML inside of SQL Server. Okay? Just some more examples. Notice that with XMLA, not only can we write queries, but we can issue commands. Right? This would be the backup command. I could issue this command against analysis services to take a backup of my database. MDX. So another language here that you're going to use if you work with analysis services is the multi-dimensional expression language. Okay? If you want to work with cubes, this is your query language for working with cubes. Transact-SQL, just to write this out. Okay? So Transact-SQL is the language for working with the database engine, okay, for querying the database engine. MDX is the language for querying cubes. Okay? You would not use Transact-SQL against a cube, and you would not use MDX against a relational database. Okay? All right, so just an example MDX query. I don't find MDX too intimidating here. You're saying from where? From my cube. Okay, where am I getting it from? Which slice? What data do I actually want? I want the data in the sales territory, Southwest. What are the measures? I'd like to get the sales amount and the discount. And then what are my dimensions that I'd like to get? I'd like to get the fiscal year 2011 and 2012. It's a little bit different syntactically, but logically, if you understand cubes, it's, in my opinion, a pretty straightforward language here. Now, just a quick tour of some of the other languages you may encounter, which we will also talk about later through the course. C# and Visual Basic. Certainly, if you are working with reporting services and want to embed this in a .NET application, if you're working in integration services and you want to perform some pretty complex calculations, you'll be able to use C# or Visual Basic for those calculations. PowerShell, DBAs, it's hard to be a DBA today without having knowledge of PowerShell, right? And some others as well. The expression language that you use in integration services and reporting services, not difficult, okay? All right, in the next video, we'll just come back a little bit and talk about how this course is arranged.